This is the Vegan Pulse, and I am your host, Nancy Arenas, sharing stories from compassionate individuals from all over the world. Today, that individual is Pria Acharya. Pria is a vegan documentary maker, writer, certified mindfulness teacher, abuse recovery coach, and a contracts administrator. With her film, Do No Harm, Priya sets out to leave a legacy, appealing to our innate, compassionate nature to do no harm, bravely examining our history, traditions, culture, and paradoxes with dairy. Let me introduce her to you. Hi, Priya, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing very good and very excited to have you on the Vegan Pulse. And I'll get to why my excitement is. But first, let's talk. You're in Denver, Colorado. Is that where you're at?
I am.
Okay, so you're right close to me. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So hi, neighbor.
Hi.
And, and let's talk about your journey into veganism to begin with.
Certainly. So I had been vegetarian my whole life, along with, I believe, my, ancestry in India. I think that was part of the Brahmin Hindu way. And so I was born into not eating meat, but, dairy was a big part of our life. And I think maybe even more so for me. I love dairy. I had to have my dairy yogurt with all my Indian food. And my mom has said how much, I liked milk as a baby. That's what, she had, I guess, given me that I took to as the fourth kid. And so I went through adolescence, growing up here and realizing that, I did have that choice. Did I want to continue being vegetarian? And, I put some thought into it and recognized, the benefit for the planet and so forth, and felt like I was doing, the correct thing by continuing to be vegetarian. I did a, speech on vegetarianism in high school in North Carolina. As a newbie, I became the quarterfinalist in the state on the debate team, and the judges would tell me how, even if I didn't win that tournament, like they were now thinking about vegetarianism, so I thought, yay, I've done this great thing. And then I was interviewed by Vegetarian Times. And so I was really into it, and I don't recall really realizing anywhere or reading anywhere that there is this harm with dairy. So I continued on thinking I'm doing this noble thing and something good for the planet by not having meat. And it was really as an adult in the past 10 years or so where I was coming across fellow vegans, and I was curious about them. But then I still was, my feeding dairy to my kids. They were really into it, and I was having it, not really making the connection in terms of the harm. And although a few of my friends were vegans, I admired them for that, but I wasn't necessarily connecting with how bad this is to consume dairy. And no one sat me down and said, hey, let me explain this to you. I did occasionally feel like vegans seem to hate vegetarians, why are they so mad at us? So I continued on. And then in my marriage to an omnivore, I'd say, within maybe the past 7 years or so, every New Year's or so, I would have this feeling, like along with many people, like it's time to detox. And so I would be like vegan at the start of January, and then he would grumble about how it's already a vegetarian home, so don't go there, don't make it harder, And so I got this resistance from him and negativity about the vegetarianism as well, that it seemed to be inconvenient for him. Although he was not vegetarian, he had his fish on the deck. And then when we went out to eat, he always ordered meat. So, I got this resistance from him and felt like as the cook in the home, I could not, be vegan. I continued to prepare things with dairy. And so finally, I think things came to a head for me around that and then other areas. And I got divorced in 2017. And at the same time, I felt like, I didn't have the resistance to go in the direction that I wanted to. And so that's when I started to look more into veganism that I had, been curious about. And then I watched What the Health. And so I think that sort of sealed the deal for me. I was already kind of heading that way, but it confirmed it more for me. So I transitioned into veganism, and so initially it was also that I didn't like to waste. So if my vegetarian daughter didn't finish her vegetarian food, I would finish it for her. It's like as our moms are sometimes in the home with the trash can, and so we don't want to waste. And so that was I think part of the parenting and the transitioning for a while. That would continue to be part of my vegan journey. Mm-hmm. It was not an overnight thing for me. I don't have a vegan, anniversary like some people do. So I think it's been more of a journey, a deepening journey.
Well, I was a person who also loved milk, as I was growing up. But the funny part about it was that it always upset my stomach. But you're told you got to drink your milk. Milk builds strong bones and is good for you, and all the lies, right? So that was one of the last things that I left was milk, because everything else was easy for me to give up, but milk was a hard one. And so I had that same struggle until my friend, when I talked to my friend Mike, and I'm like, what's the difference between vegan and vegetarian? I mean, come on, what's the difference? And then he told me about the animals and the suffering and so forth, and how they kept the cows and the calves and all that stuff. And so I went vegan there. And I wanted to touch on another thing that you said about sometimes vegetarians think that vegans don't like them. I don't think that that's the case. They're just wondering why not go the rest of the way, because of the harm to the animals. And I think that maybe sometimes, like myself, when I was vegetarian, I didn't even think about that. I didn't think about the animals. You're not eating them, so they're not killing them. But then you forget about the part, yeah, but now they're in a lifelong situation where they're raped, impregnated over and over, and their babies are taken away. And so you don't really think about that or make that connection. So I think that that's kind of how I see it when people say, oh, vegans don't like vegetarians. I don't think that's true. I think that they're just saying, okay, see the rest of the picture or something like that. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it is a mistake, I think, for vegans to assume that vegetarians are aware of the connections and for whatever reason not going all the way. Having, trying to remember what it was like for me as a vegetarian. I think it would have really helped me if a vegan friend sat down and explained to me, like, here's why I'm vegan, and then here's what happens, and from a caring friend who is just sharing their journey. And I think that would have helped me. And so I think that is partly behind me doing this documentary project. Is trying to be, how do I be that friend to vegetarians and carnists on here's the picture, here's why. And so that's part of the point. I don't think it's I don't think it's usually beyond the ignorance factor. And like we were talking about tradition, when I went to India, I experienced, my relatives and so many just having their regular dairy, like I did, like I grew up. And I think that people don't usually, question what they're doing every day and what they were sort of born into doing, right? When you're a baby, you're not making choices, right? You do what your providers are providing you. That's what you go with. You have the milk because that's what you grew up having. You don't one day wake up and go, I wonder if my parents are doing the right thing by giving me this milk. It's what you do. I think humans are they're we're habits of creatures of habits, right? And a lot, like with many things, we just do what has been habitual. And so I think that's what it is. And I felt like doing this documentary project would hopefully allow awareness to happen. And the hope was that, like with me, when you have more awareness, then you can potentially choose to do different with your habits.
Exactly. And that's why, you have pictures out there that vegans, vegetarians, they share and people get upset about them. But if you don't know, how could you change? And if you were that victim, would you want it exposed? So let's talk about your documentary, Do No Harm.
Absolutely. So I, as I mentioned, I became vegan in 2017. And then the past 3 years, I decided to explore mindfulness. And as part of my mindfulness teacher certification training, we were to espouse the precept of do no harm. And that was a primary precept. And so as a vegan going into the program, I think I may have had an assumption that as part of this precept that, we're all vegan, like it's a given, that is part of this precept. So I was very surprised and taken aback as I experienced my classmates sort of circumvent this precept in terms of how they were continuing to eat meat, mindfully eating meat, humane killing, and so forth. And so I was very confused by this, and it sort of prompted a spiritual crisis for me. And I think as part of really espousing this precept myself, it led to creating this documentary project. I wanted to do more. And by this point, my vegan journey had deepened extensively so that I wasn't, just a vegan quietly in my home. I had to continue on to do more and becoming an activist and transforming into that. And so this became part of my activism.
And you talk about customs and traditions, which is awesome because sometimes, like we were talking before, we just do what we're told and we don't question things. Sometimes vegans question things now, but you know what I'm saying? Traditions, that's the way it's always been done. One of the worst statements that there ever has been. And you think that it's time to look at those things and evolve out of there.
Absolutely. Right. As we were saying before, our ancestors were just imperfect people as well, just living, how they were raised in their times. And we can't just try to replicate that because, for one, the times have changed. There's more population. Things aren't done the same way. And then in India, there's an added component of, cultural history around the mythology of Krishna, which includes imagery of him consuming dairy. And so there is that excuse of, well, Krishna had dairy. But, the mythology is that Krishna was a cow herder and he loved his cows. And there is no indication in the mythology of abuse towards the cows. And so it's very different, what is happening with dairy here in the US and India is abusive. It's it's exploitation and it's murder. So this is not at all what, Krishna would support. So people aren't thinking about those types of connections. They're not thinking about the reality of what's really happening now.
Right. And like you said, it's torture, murder, and they're victims. And we are over exploiting all of them. And when we exploit one, it is very easy to cross over and exploit another. And people don't get that connection either sometimes.
Absolutely. Right. I read repeatedly how, for instance, the people who work in factory farms, if they're not psychopaths when they start taking the job, it's like they can become that. It's at least traumatizing to be dealing with slaughter day in, day out, hearing and seeing all the suffering.
Right, because those animals are crying, they're screaming, they're trying to get away, they know what's happening, they could smell the blood, they see their friends being murdered. So yes, and you talked about being mindful and a spiritual journey, and you're ingesting. If you're a spiritual person, you have to understand that you are ingesting all the suffering, all the torturing into your body. And who would want to do that knowingly?
Absolutely. Yes, that's very true. And my thought around that, as I was trying to figure out, like, why are people doing this? Even at spiritual places, like I was just at a retreat where there was dairy. And again, I think it comes back to like tradition, people disconnecting, people not wanting to connect that way, because I think to think that, okay, the animals felt fear and you're ingesting that fear, then you have to think that the animals are worthy of consideration, that they are not creatures that we have dominion over. So I think there's other facets for people to sort of get at before I think they can connect with that kind of idea, like you're ingesting fear, because then they have to think like animals feel fear. So I think there's so many pieces to that I'm trying to get my head around in terms of how to address all of these layers. Now that I'm starting post-production with my fellow producer, and we're having these talks and formulating the script, and I'm trying to understand all of these angles, because I want to make sure that what I'm creating is sensitive and addresses all of these layers so that it's not overly blunt and that it can be something that people can connect with. But so that is something that, it's concerning to me, because part of me was at this retreat last week in Hawaii, where I was accommodated for, gratefully, with vegan food. However, there was dairy there for the volunteers, and I saw a volunteer in line for pork. So I was going back, disappointed and not really feeling like I had the retreat experience I hoped for. And also feeling like I wish I somehow had more influence, and feeling like I didn't have enough. So there was all of those layers too. And I did have an elderly volunteer tell me not to, that my veganism was my opinion, as I try to just state the reality, and that to not bring it to her space. And so that was, what I was told my last day. And so, this is someone who is a longtime meditator, who considers herself spiritual. So I think it seemed to me like there can be even more resistance in these environments where it's even more important, right? That they espouse veganism, and it's not happening, at this these retreat centers that are supposed to be the places that nurture the mindfulness teachers so they can go out into the world with their messages. So yes, it's very complicated. Like, how would I have begun to have the conversation with her to say, hey, you're consuming fear, by the way, there wouldn't have been open ears. It's very complicated. I think people really want to hold on to, don't tell me what I've been doing for so many years is wrong.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it's like before I went vegan, like I would have my cousin say, "Do you know what they do?" And I'm like, "La la la la, I'm not listening. Just I don't want to know because if I know, you do that just like this. Don't bring it into my space." They don't want to know because if they know, then they have a responsibility to think about that, and then they have to own up to the part that they're not that spiritual, or they don't have that connection to be really truly spiritual. Because I think that if you are, just like you said, not only there but religions, places where they're talking about health, climate change talks that don't serve plant-based food are missing the problem. They're just ignoring it blatantly because they know it, but they don't want to like walk the talk.
right. I think it takes courage, right? Because, for instance, for this elderly woman, part of it would have had to be, she would have had to have been at a level of acknowledging, oh my gosh, I have been a part of harm. What I have been doing, has been participating in harm. I didn't know everything, I think it takes courage, right, for any human to say, I've been imperfect. I have been uninformed. I've been ignorant. I didn't know the best, way to be. And so I think it takes courage for some people to be able to grow, right? That's a process of evolving and growing, to first say, oh gosh, I was, not doing things in the best way, and to grieve, right? Participated in all this level of harm. I've had a vegan friend who has cried over all the animals he has consumed. But I think you have to go through that. I think you have to have the courage to go through this uncomfortable process with grief, and be able to then, find compassion, self-compassion for yourself, and to be able to then come out of it on the other end. So I think it's very difficult for people, like you said, like, yeah, don't tell me, because then I have to take the responsibility. And it's, a lot of people don't want to have to deal with that. They don't want to know. Don't tell me, that I need to grow into. They're not ready to do that.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that they're too hard on themselves because you don't have to feel guilty because you didn't know.
Right.
You have to understand and give yourself, some compassion because you didn't know before, but now you do. And what you do from here on, that's where your real thoughts should be in, knowing and not acting. That's a different thing than not knowing and just doing what you've been told, and understanding that that's just the way it's been and stuff like that. That's a different mindset. So I think that there's two different faces to that.
Right. Yeah, I do think there are people who I think who really want, I think, to do the best. I think I was one of those people where I was receptive to hearing the information, and dealing with it. And that's partly, I think, where I was at too with my mindfulness program. Um, it was something that I took in deeply, this precept. And I, for myself, wanted to figure out how I can deepen in not causing harm, right? And so for me, for instance, it included that in my home, I've had a vegetarian daughter, and I had purchased dairy for her. But then, in the second year of my program, last year, I announced to her, I will no longer be purchasing dairy. So that was the next step for me. So even for vegans, right, it's a journey in terms of deepening how deep we go, and then whether we're going to be activists. And so there's levels. And so that was another level for me where not only was I vegan, it was making the stance that I will not pay for dairy, and that meant having to butt heads with my daughter, and her dad, who was pressuring me, like, she needs choices and da da da. And so I stayed firm on that I would not pay, and we even went on vacation together, and I made it clear, I will, when you choose non-vegan, I will not pay for that meal. And so, and on travel and on planes and wherever I've gone, I've had to make this choice. I will not pay for this. I will not pay for abuse. And so I've taken, a lot of, pressure around that. And so that was a choice, a deepening that I made that had personal implications for me. And that included, I won't pay for school lunches. And that became, another layer more recently, within the past 6 months, because, they're not vegan. And I have called the schools, like, I need for my daughter to have vegan choices. And so I feel like those are, at least they're small voices, but they're something, even when I call the airline and say, I need the vegan option, I think it makes a difference. And I think more people need to do that. I think.
Yes,
it
most
is, yeah.
certainly. Now we're coming to the end of the interview, and I thank you for this time and for all your knowledge that you've shared with us. But tell us, you're in the final stage for your documentary.
So yes, we've just finished our campaign on Seed and Spark, and we are now in post-production. So we've successfully gone through the campaign, and I'm completely open to followers there. And if anyone would like to contribute, you're welcome to reach out to me. You can find me on as Vegan Pria on Instagram, and then you can message me as well, likely through the Do No Harm Project on Seed and Spark. And you can continue to support that project that way, and then follow it so you can hear about where we're at in post-production, as I will continue to provide updates.
Awesome. And I will have all that information on our pages so that people know where to go exactly. Thank you, Priya. It has been a pleasure to talk to you. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
you and what you're doing. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you for joining us on the Vegan Pulse. Until our next episode, please live a life of kindness, a lifestyle that benefits your health, the animals, and the planet. And remember, if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. Live vegan.